Welcome to Chapter 22, Psychosocial Development in Adulthood from ages 25 to 65. This is going to be our last chapter in this age group. All right, let's start off by reviewing some things we've been talking about throughout the course, but never really put a name on. When we talk about these different theories, Piaget's theory of cognitive development, Ericksons' theory of psychosocial development, Freud's theory of psychosexual development, when we talk about these different theories, some of them take a normative crisis approach and some of them take a much more stable-based approach. The three that I just mentioned are all normative crisis approach theories. So let's talk about that. I'm going to use Jung as a good example of what normative crisis approaches do, and hopefully that'll help to clarify what that term means. So Carl Jung was a follower of Sigmund Freud, and one area where he differed from Freud was that he really emphasized that we're all on a quest for finding meaning in our lives. Freud didn't really talk about that at all. He had that, sexual motivation as his underlying theory, and Jung was like, I beg to differ. I think that people are really trying to figure out what the purpose of life is. For Jung, he saw midlife as a very important transition. So here's where a crisis is likely to occur, according to Jung. That we've been going through maybe a period of normative behavior where things are all sort of stable and normal and fine. And at midlife, there's a transition that can be a crisis point. He says because prior to age 40, we're really focused on our obligations to our families, of origin, our moms and dads and our siblings, stuff like that. Then our obligations to the family that we create and our obligations to our employers and things like that. He says we tend to focus really heavily on figuring out how to fulfill those obligations and how to fit in and satisfy the people who largely are over us in all those examples, right? All the things I listed there, a lot of times we're talking about people who have some control in our lives. And so we're trying to focus on fulfilling, what they expect from us. Even in the case of the families that we create ourselves, there's a certain obligation between the romantic partners who started the family, right? A certain amount of obligation to the offspring that may emerge from that. It's all very obligation focused. So he said that because there's such a focus on obligations, females tend to emphasize the kinds of personality characteristics that go along with the typically female obligations that are present, prior to age 40. So because females so often are caring for children, and things like that prior to age 40, he says that they develop traits such as expressiveness and nurturance. And it's strictly because of the obligations that they find themselves needing to fulfill. He says that males, on the other hand, tend to emphasize achievement prior to age 40, because that's how males, ultimately achieve their lifelong goals, is to be successful at work so that then they can, attract a romantic partner and start a family. Females are more likely to attract a romantic partner with whom to start a family when they are expressive and they display evidence of nurturance and these stereotypical things. So he's very much focusing on very classic, stereotypical masculine and feminine behaviors, and he says that we display these things prior to age 40 more often because of the obligations that we find ourselves in. He says once the career is established and the children have grown, now at midlife, adults have the opportunity to say, do I really want to be doing these things? So he says they start to turn themselves toward their inner selves, and they start to focus on what really makes them happy and what kind of person they really are. I've already done all my obligatory things. Now maybe I can start looking around and saying, do I really want to be expressive and nurturant, or do I really want to be achievement motivated? And start looking at what we really want. He says that happens at midlife because about midlife we start to realize, life is one day going to end. And do I want to spend all of it fulfilling my obligations to other people, or do I want to start to figure out what my own personal self wants? So this is a really great model, and I've never really discussed Jung in this class before, but it's a really great model of this normative crisis idea, The idea that you can go along, everything's going fine, we're all sort of, sticking to our rut and, kind of going along. And then a crisis point comes up. Your last child leaves home. Maybe you get a promotion or something like that. And it's sort of a shock to the system. And it makes the person reflect and decide, what they really want to do going forward. Do they really want to continue the way that they're going, or would they like to find a new rut to get into? Now, another example of a normative crisis approach is Erickson's psychosexual stages. We've been talking about this throughout class because Erickson is the only normative crisis theorist who believes that we have a series of crises that we face across our lifespan. He even calls them crises. So you probably notice, at least the crisis part, the idea in this model is that there are periods of everything going fine, normalcy. So as you recall, just a little revisiting for you, adolescence, you're bound up in trying to figure out who you are or falling into role confusion. In this chart that I found, notice it's got a header over there that says transition years. You're transitioning from the demands of childhood into the demands of adulthood. So you've got the transition years of adolescence. Then we enter adulthood proper. And I already introduced the idea of intimacy versus isolation as a crisis because this is something that sometimes we start addressing in adolescence. But Erickson thought that it was a crisis that sort of hangs over us simultaneously with the identity crisis, but then well beyond it. Like once you've figured out who you are, you're still trying to make sure that you're forming an intimate bond with someone, to have an affectionate relationship with someone. Once we enter middle age, Erickson says that our attention turns to the crisis that he calls generativity versus self-absorption. So in this crisis, we're trying to figure out a way to basically leave our mark behind. And in this period, we're concerned about our family, especially the offspring that we're producing, and getting them launched and fully formed adults. We're also showing a lot of concern for society in general during middle age, and as the kids get older, it's even more so that the generative mind will turn towards society in general. So you may see more volunteer work, or you may see mentoring, or you may see writing a book that you think will leave behind things that you've learned or things that you know or understand. These are things that are really characteristic of middle age, where a person has enough knowledge and enough free time and enough ability to be able to leave these marks on society, or at least the portion of society that they have influence over. If a person doesn't display generativity, they can end up stuck in self-absorption, where they aren't worried about anybody else or who will be left here after the individual's gone, and those kinds of things. They're not thinking about that. They're much more concerned about themselves. And so for Erickson, the healthy way to be focused during middle age is on outward influences. The final stage, which we'll talk about in more depth in the next segment of the lifespan, is the aging years. And I just wanted to kind of wrap this whole normative crisis approach up here. But we will talk about the integrity versus despair segment when we get to the next age bracket. But so for most adults, they're probably bound up right now in the crisis of intimacy versus isolation, and then they turn their attention to generativity versus self-absorption. Now, one thing I really want to criticize about Erickson's model is that while he does acknowledge that identity versus role confusion can overlap intimacy versus isolation, he doesn't really argue that other things can overlap. But I would argue against that. I would say that you can be striving for finding an intimate relationship while also figuring out ways to be generative. I think he was a little too crisis based, where it's one crisis, you resolve it, and then you move to the next one. I think I'm a little bit more of a stability theorist. But I do see a lot of people kind of struggling with multiple things at a time, and that's why I kind of think that it's not. I don't think he was completely right on this. This box kind of model that he's got here. Well, we're going to talk about Erickson's model throughout the rest of this chapter. So we'll be talking about intimacy versus isolation, and then generativity versus self-absorption as this chapter goes on. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea. Is there such a thing as a midlife crisis? Jung thought that there was. Erickson kind of thought that there is. And, this cartoon drawer obviously thinks so. CEO midlife crisis. And then she's saying, I'm beginning to feel a genuine concern for my employees. Like, oh no, what a crisis. Here's a picture I found on the internet. I don't know if this person's going through a midlife crisis, but it kind of looks like the stereotypical midlife crisis to me. I think the only thing that he's done wrong is that his car is black instead of red. He's got his convertible. I love that he's shirtless for some reason. And now he just needs to find his inappropriately young trophy romantic partner to put in that other seat. And we've got the whole stereotype of what happens at the midlife crisis wrapped up in one picture here. This is something that people have been talking about for a really long time. I've told you before that my mom in particular, had a lot of these books on her bookshelf when I was growing up, and this is one, Passages by Gail Sheehy. The Seasons of a Man's Life, that came out in 1978. You and Your Husband's Midlife Crisis came out in 1980. Like, this was a really popular topic during my adolescent years. This idea, and I think a lot of it has to do with the growing the middle-aged baby boomers. They were starting to get into that phase where they might be having a crisis. And so a lot of books were written. Anything that was happening for baby boomers, that meant that people would write books, do movies, do all sorts of stuff, because that's a big market of people to talk to. And so the baby boomers were always a good marker of what we should be talking about at the moment. So it was really super popular to talk about that when I was growing up, so I kind of thought it was a normal thing. But really, there is not a lot of scientific evidence to suggest that people go into a crisis mode where they really are trying to figure out who they are, what they should do, how are they ever going to leave a mark on this world. There's not a lot of scientific evidence that this is a standard part of adult development, to go into a crisis mode when you turn 40 to 50 years old. Really, what the best predictor of a midlife crisis is whether the person had earlier crises. If this was a person who really struggled through adolescence, it wouldn't be surprising to find out that they are now having a midlife crisis, because they might just sort of have a lot of difficulty going through different developmental stages. But for the vast majority of people, midlife is not a period of time where they need to read a lot of books to figure out how to handle themselves. There may be a reassessment of what is important. I know in our household, I've already mentioned that my husband stayed home full time with the kids. And so when the youngest was old enough to drive himself, it really took away a lot of the, drudgery part of parenting for him, where it was really time consuming. He wasn't having to chauffeur him around. And he went through a bit of a phase where he was trying to figure out what he was supposed to be doing with his free time. He did do that. I wouldn't call it a crisis per se, but he was sort of reevaluating. Okay, I've got a bunch of hours of free in my day now, and this is not my job anymore. Like, raising kids is no longer my job, and so I have to figure out what my new job is. And so initially he made a hobby into his job and became national champion traditional archer. And then since we've moved to the east side of the state, he's become a volunteer firefighter. And so he's found other things to put all of that energy into that he used to put into raising the kids. And that's what a lot of people do. We go through these periods where we think, okay, well, now what am I going to do? I didn't have as much of that challenge as he did because I was working. And so it was easier for me to say, well, obviously this is what I'm doing. But we all went through a little bit of a crisis when we made a decision to come to the east side of the state, because I wasn't willing to move unless my children were willing to move. And so that was a crisis point in the sense of, do we want to stay together? And I'll just continue doing what I'm doing if everybody agrees that we want to stay together, or you guys have to figure out something new to do on the other side of the state, or would we be willing to actually separate and be like 4 hours away from our grandchildren and stuff like that? And we opted for stay together and move across the state. So, that was a bit of a crisis, as everybody was having to make a decision independently about what they wanted to do and how to solve it. And, everybody was an adult in that scenario, but some of us were midlife and some of us were young adults, and yet it was kind of a crisis. Should we move? Should we not move? My son-in-law's family was not happy with the decision, and that was a really tough thing. And so it's, life is full of moments of decision, I don't know that we can say Jung was correct and that midlife is the quintessential time when that happens. It's probably more that we are just always reevaluating our identities, that, as the demands on us change, we may reevaluate. Well, okay, well, now what are we going to do to fill that void? I used to have kids demanding things of me, or I used to work for this particular employer. My daughter quit working for an employer who was very demanding and was requiring a lot of her time. And when she first quit that job, she was like kind of at a loss for what to do with all the free time she had. That's, it's a normal part of what is my identity. And she, for a while, had become, her identity was workaholic. And then she was like, but that wasn't by choice. So what is my identity? I think it's part of normal identity search to be reevaluating periodically as things change, as we grow, as circumstances alter, and so on. So I personally don't think that there's a crisis. The evidence is not supportive of the idea of this out of nowhere, out of the blue midlife crisis. It's probably really just a bunch of other things going on that might culminate in buying a convertible and driving around without your shirt on. All right, let's go ahead and stop here. And in the next segment, we'll pick up with one of the main relationships, which for the average person, that's going to be marriage. So I'll see you over there.